Thank you, Angeles. First, I wanted to show you that I brought a little friend with me. This is architect Barbie. It's her 2011, it's the Career of the Year, Architect Barbie. And she has really come a long way. You'll see, I'm feedbacking on myself here. You'll see that she has, she's come equipped with a hard hat. And I've heard that this hard hat really comes in handy for protection. She was overheard saying, "Codes and regulations, whatever." Well, I'm sorry, I can't believe I said something so self-deprecating against women architects just to break the ice. But in fact, I'm really proud of Barbie. She has come a long way. I was really honored when Angeles asked me to participate in this lecture series, and relieved that she gave me a topic, because I can't begin to imagine, especially because I'm following on the heels of Rob Quigley, that I could talk about my own work for a whole hour. So I'm eternally grateful that that I will be attempting to answer the question, can good architecture be regulated? And stated in another way, do all the regulations we encase ourselves in help or hinder good design? For this talk, I'm going to focus my attention on residential architecture, since we only have an hour, and this is the area of my professional expertise and interest. My preconceived answer to the question is, well, regulations can only hinder if it's your house. For certainly there are too many regulations interfering with the brilliant design you and your architect are envisioning. But these same regulations can help if it's your neighbor's house, for there are seemingly never enough regulations to prevent your neighbor from making some sort of a mess of things. But architecture is a functional art with a practical purpose. And because of this, every architectural design needs to begin with constraints. The utility of architecture as shelter sets specific constraints to begin with. It keeps out the wind and the rain, the predators. It provides privacy. The building program, which is the homeowner's list of requirements for the house, is the next set of constraints. To develop the program, I would discuss with my clients the number of occupants that intend to live in the house, what are the room and spatial needs, like how many bedrooms, what's the size of the kitchen, are there any special hobbies or interests and activities. It would also include physical constraints or attributes of the site, like the size and configuration of the site. Is it a level terrain or a sloping hillside? What's the solar orientation, proximity to any neighboring structures, and scenic view potentials? These are just a few, but these are givens. I might also ask if there's a style, a particular style they might have in mind, or is it modern, Spanish, traditional? So again, part of the building program. The building codes and regulations are also given. Building codes. So the building codes are going to be the health, safety, welfare issues. They're going to talk about structural stability. They're going to govern things like plumbing and electrical and mechanical, and fire safety. So these are things that we've learned over time, and we really need them, and they're for our own good. Design regulations are more specific to place and intended for concepts of keeping, say, a residential neighborhood looking residential, or a downtown central business district looking urban. So in general, and the design regulations might also dictate materials and styles, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. So in general, codes and regulations help or hinder good design, no more or no less than any other element of the program. And a 15-foot front yard setback should be considered in the same spirit as the homeowner's need for extra closet space or the desire for Spanish architecture, for example. So from this, you might take to believe that, that I believe that codes and regulations need not necessarily inhibit good design. But before you think I've just given the shortest talk ever on the subject, I assure you there's a few more things I'd like to discuss on it. So which regulations? Well, in preparation for this talk, I ran through the list of regulations that would impact a project here in La Jolla. First is the California Building Code, the CBC, which provides for the health, safety, welfare of building users. And since this governs the structure's ability to stand, as I'd mentioned a moment ago, we have to have it. But some of the other codes that are a little more subjective, well, we have plenty of them. We have the Land Development Code, which is the LDC, and you're going to hear me say LDC a number of times. Yes, those are my initials, but it stands for Land Development Code for tonight. There's the La Jolla Community Plan and Local Coastal Program Land Use Plan, and that is one code, just with a very long title. And it covers things like natural resources and open space, transportation, residential development, commercial development, community facilities, parks, heritage resources, and has appendices covering topics such as street trees and physical and view access to our beaches and oceans. There's the California Green Building Code, California Energy Code, California Environmental Quality Act, American Disability Act, the Historic Resources Board. Okay, that's important. There's the Multiple Species Conservation Act. The list goes on, but I'll stop. Maybe we do have too many codes, but for sure we have them all for very good reasons. So we know we need the codes, but do they have to be a necessary evil, or can they be a source of inspiration? In La Jolla, the code with the biggest impact on design is dependent on the neighborhood and the type of housing product. And so just real quickly, we have the Land Development Code and the La Jolla Community Plan. Those work together. We have CC&Rs, which would cover subdivisions, CC&Rs being covenants, conditions, and restrictions. They would also cover plan unit developments. And then we have plan district ordinances. And La Jolla has two, La Jolla Plan District and La Jolla Shores Plan District, the latter of which I'm going to get into a little more this evening. So we start with the Land Development Code, and this is the applicable code for most of La Jolla's residential neighborhoods, like Bird Rock and Barber Track. It identifies neighborhoods. It identifies which neighborhoods are in which zones, single family versus multifamily, covers issues of setback, height limits, floor area ratios, lot coverage, and regulates items like parking, fences, landscaping. The code's rather long and detailed, but specific enough to clarify the restrictions. And details have been added over the years to address problem areas such as height limitations and how to interpret height. Floor area ratios have been defined and clarified. Talks about what actually counts as building area. I know I'm sort of going over things that maybe half of you deal with every single day and you're thinking, oh man, done with it. And the other half, I'm at least trying to touch on things and give just a general enough idea so that you kind of know where I'm going with the rest of this talk. So the La Jolla Community Plan works, the La Jolla Community Plan and Local Coastal Land Use Plan works in conjunction with the Land Development Code. Where the Land Development Code is specific, the Community Plan would speak more in generalities. It covers density and community character. It uses terms such as ambiance and visual harmony. It has concerns regarding development near coastal bluffs or geologically unstable lands. We have abundant of both. It mentions bulk and scale a number of times, although it doesn't really give a clear definition of what it means by bulk and scale. The next is the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, covenants, and restrictions for subdivisions, gated communities, condominiums, and then there's the planned unit developments. The gated community of Windermere is a local example of a planned unit development and has the CC&Rs regulating owners' abilities to modify their units. This community of Windermere was designed with a certain aesthetic in mind. The buildings all have a unifying design theme, having common building materials and a limited color palette. The original design inspiration became the regulation, if you will. All modifications must conform to what is already there. And while the homeowners are all restricted in their ability to utilize, they're restricted in their ability to individualize their home, at least they know that going in at the time of purchase. And they needn't worry because of these restrictions, that their neighbors will make changes that they don't like. You see, CC&Rs can be very specific about what an owner can and cannot do to the exterior of their homes or residential units. Now, what they do to the interior is entirely up to them, and it may be a good place for the Hello Kitty memorabilia. The third type of regulation is the Planned District Ordinance, the PDO, and I'm going to use La Jolla Shores PDO as my example. These codes augment and or largely replace part of the Land Development Code. The La Jolla Shores PDO was written to protect La Jolla Shores from the high-rise development happening in the 1960s and early 70s. And the neighbors were concerned. A lot of these high-rise were high-rise apartment buildings, and the community felt something needed to be done, so they approached the city and said, please help us here. So some examples from the ordinance include characterizing a typical single-family residence as having extensive use of glass, wood, shake, or shingle overhang roofs, a low rambling silhouette. Additionally, it says, but with these limitations, originality and diversity in architecture is encouraged. The theme, unity with variety, is the guiding principle. But unity without variety means simple monotony. Variety by itself is chaos. So I feel like they were trying to write some inspiration into the code. The ordinance was trying to limit materials and to describe a certain style without being overly specific. The authors wanted homeowners to have some freedom in designing their homes. Now, you won't find many numbers in this PDO. It won't be very specific about what your setbacks are. And for better or worse, it does not say just how big a house you can build. The La Jolla Shores Design Manual is a document that supports the PDO. It includes similar wording as the actual PDO, and it gives some examples and expanded wording. It's going to include some design principles regarding the grading, lighting, landscaping, parking, street layout. It gives roof shapes. You can see on the slide on the left some ideas of what roofs might look like, and it is pretty specific about limiting building materials and colors. All three codes provide differently for the neighborhoods they serve. But for all three, there was an original intent of cohesiveness and, to varying degrees, the ability to individualize, whether tolerant or intolerant of this ability. So in a subdivision such as Windermere, there's a very cohesive design dictated with within a variety of building products, condos, homes. There's reference in the community plan that states certain features that contribute to the community character are quite evident. So the design style is fixed, and you can depend on it. I mentioned that many parts of La Jolla, such as Bird Rock and Barber Track, rely on the LDC together with the community plan to govern design. And these areas count on the LDC to be specific about setbacks, heights, offsets, floor area ratios. The LDC does not specifically mention materials, colors, or styles. There is design freedom and flexibility, though not completely unlimited. The community plan acknowledges this by referring to residential diversity, which is emphasized more than a uniform theme or development pattern. So it's looking for diversity as opposed to conformity. And bulk and scale are important factors. And within these limitations, there is much that the architect and the homeowner can do relative to design. While the codes may not say anything inspirational, the restrictions written into the code, as I said early on, they need not be any more confining than any of the other constraints. For the La Jolla Shores PDO, I believe what the authors were after was contextual architecture. It's a more recent term that, by definition, suggests an architecture that responds to its surroundings by respecting what is already there. In recent years, social, economic, and market forces have had influence on the area and this ordinance, which at one time was very useful and may even have provided some design inspiration, but it's fallen on tough times through alternative interpretations. And by lack of clear expectations, arguments over building size and scale have become commonplace. So these three examples may sound confusing, and maybe they are, and that's why architects and planners oftentimes have postgraduate degrees. So I'd like to give an analogy to help keep them straight. I would like to think of these regulations as differing parenting styles. So for the democratic, which also authoritative, that's the LDC and the La Jolla Community Plan. And it presents it represents parents who set rules and their expectations are clear. Like, be in at 10 o'clock, or brush your teeth after every meal. But they allow the kids to come up with their own designs, their own games, however fascinating or boring. But when one of the kids breaks the rules or finds a loophole, Dad, the city, may chastise them, make them correct their mistake, but he has been known to go back and to provide clarification on the rule so that there's no confusion the next time the kid wants to pull that stunt. Or with the younger kids who are looking as an example, looking on as an example. The next example of parenting styles is the authoritarian. This is for the planned development like Windermere or Black Horse Farms. You have very strict parents with firm limits and few options. They've laid out the design and the children follow it. The kids are very polite and they're predictable and they're reliable, but they're not encouraged to think for themselves or to get very creative. On the far opposite extreme, you have the permissive parents. And that's what I consider the La Jolla Shore's PDO parent. They've established their parenting expectations. They've told the kids conceptually what's expected of them. Don't be late. Brush your teeth. They give some specifics, but then at the same time they gave permission to test the limits. And then they suggested they behave more or less like their older siblings. And so the kids learned by example. If one night one of the older kids came in at 10:05 and not much happened, well, maybe the next night it's 10:10. And before you know it, because kids like to test the limits, they're all coming in at 11. So in this parenting analogy, both parents have to be approached for permission. The local advisory board, the La Jolla Shores Advisory Board, is mom in this scenario, and she's often the stricter of the two. Dad down at the city, you know, he allows more issues to slide. Maybe it's because the rules initially were a little vague and they're a little harder to discipline. And that there are examples of older siblings and other projects getting away with something similar. So maybe what started out as sound parenting got a little out of hand. And if these two entities would take some advice from the current parenting guidebooks, it isn't too late to go back and clarify the rules and reestablish the boundaries. So all three types of design regulations at some point were based on consensus. And for the two that allow some flexibility of design, there needs to be some allowance for evolution, like evolution of tastes, spatial needs, market factors, and standards of living. As a noted local architect Michael Stepner has said in the past, if you achieve a community's understanding and consensus about what you want for your neighborhood, you can write the code on the back of an envelope. And I think that maybe is a little bit of what happened in La Jolla Shores. Consensus came from people who understood the issues. They wrote their codes, maybe not on the back of an envelope, mind you, but in terms that they could understand. They had a grasp on the big picture. But here's the catch. The authors of the codes weren't always the people who continued to use the code. I mean, yes, there were architects involved in the original writing and they'd use it, but time has passed, and people using the codes, they might be lay people, they might be newcomers, they might be, you know, the next generation down at the city. 30 years have passed. I mean, young kids are at the city now. But they weren't in on the original consensus. And if not spelled out for them, they may never understand the goals of what the goals were. They may not agree with the consensus. Or as I said, more than likely, because it's 30 years later, no one remembers the consensus part because only vague references were made in the written document. And maybe the original authors didn't need to articulate in writing what they had in mind because everybody understood the concepts and they understood the character. But as time goes by, the buildings and lifestyles change, and bit by bit, the character is watered down. And so the character 30 or 40 years ago is not the character of what we have today. So over time, all the buildings referred to in the original documents, they're gone, or they're looking a bit tired and outdated. And we might look at these buildings, we might look at the code and say, oh, certainly these aren't the ones we're supposed to be matching. That's our current generation. But the reality is that at some point on the way to historic, neighborhood character sometimes gets looking dated and uninteresting. And where's the inspiration? So when I look at this photo, and this is a project I did in La Jolla Shores. When I look at the photos of the old house now, I see a house that 30 or 40 years ago probably fit very well in the old La Jolla Shores, with the use of the wood siding, and they have the vertical board and batten. They have the wood shingle roof, the use of the overhangs. It's a bit low and rambling, except for maybe that awkward second-story addition, which was put on, I think, in the 70s. And maybe it did look a little bit tired. And there were structural issues and mold concerns. And you know, the new homeowners who had lived in La Jolla for years, they wanted a great beach house. So I followed the PDO's design guidelines, the extensive use of glass, the shake or shingle roof, back when we could use shake or shingle, and I gave it a low rambling silhouette, sort of. But the guidelines also said, within these limitations, originality and diversity in architecture is encouraged. The theme unity with variety is the guiding principle. Now, admittedly, this house looks a little more East Coast beach house rather than West Coast beach house, but I think this style really seemed to suit the homeowners very well, and it suited them better than the shabby chic of the old house. And while this house has been well received, and I've heard that from many of the neighbors it's their favorite house, it is an example of how the character has changed from the original aesthetic, little by little. I think it's also, I'm just going to sort of flip through all these slides. I think it's interesting to note that many people want to live in traditional houses, just like the one they grew up in. But there's also many people just as passionate that they will not live in that kind of house. That was the past. That was their parents' house. They want their own identity. Architects are asked to create homes that reflect the client's own personalities and tastes, all within the guidelines and restrictions of the governing codes. And this house, the interiors are by Elizabeth Thiel-Barquette, and I think she did a beautiful job. And I love the light fixture she found. And she too had to capture the homeowner's wants and desires. So this project is showing an example of what I call character elevation, character evolution. But we've also got evolution of size and scale. This next project, this design was in response to a request to reproduce a 100-plus-year-old cottage that's currently on Park Row. This is up in the Muirlands. And the design challenge here is all about scale. The original house, which is the Devaney residence on Park Row, and it was built in 1905, was probably built as a vacation cottage, and if I had more time, I'd have gone and read the historic report that was done on it. I'm guessing it's single wall construction. I bet it had a tiny kitchen with an ice box rather than a refrigerator. I'm sure it had indoor plumbing, but 1 bathroom, 2 bathrooms maybe? Certainly not 6. The old house is very charming, and you know, oftentimes it's easy to be charming at 1,500 square feet. But try being charming at well over 6,000 square feet. But nonetheless, that was our goal. One of the first differences between old houses and new houses in La Jolla, well, anywhere in fact, is that the amenities, the size of the closets, the size of the kitchen, the number and size of the bathrooms, and the number and size of the bedrooms. Years ago, kids shared bedrooms with their siblings. We probably all did. I know my 6 brothers and sisters were always squeezed into just 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. Bathrooms were typically down the hall rather than being en suite with private access directly from the bedroom. And the tiny 2x3 closet, maybe if it was that large, has transformed into a 5x7 walk-in. In some houses, closets are the size of bedrooms now. I frequently allocate at least the same amount of square footage area for the master bathroom and for the master closet as I do for the bedroom itself, if not more. It's just that what we've gotten used to. I don't know why we have so many more clothes now than we used to, but and shoes. So it's no wonder that a modest house today is much bigger than a modest house of yesterday. And keep in mind that many of La Jolla's older homes were built as vacation homes. And who needed a big closet if you were only there for a few months? And so we have size evolution. And with that past project, I showed the character evolution. And with each new building, the surroundings change, and you get bigger homes and slightly different character, and maybe you're still using the same building materials, but it doesn't look like the old neighborhood. Now for this house, I've mentioned design challenges of reinterpreting the tiny cottage, reinterpreting the scale of the tiny cottage while maintaining its apparent size, character, and intimate charm. The final floor plan looks like an odd H with a tail. You can see it sort of shaded there. The wings of the house really help address the connection of the interior spaces to the exterior. A century ago, the cottage was compact. All the rooms were together, adjoining one another. And with a small house, you can do that. You know, you'd go from the living room into the bedroom or out back to the living room and into the kitchen, and all the rooms were connected that way. But this house, it needs light and air and ventilation for all the rooms. So spreading the plan out into the H keeps the spaces adjoining, but yet able to breathe with spaces that are much more lively. The H also allows a wonderful three-dimensional layering effect to happen where portions of the building are seen through other portions. So in this slide, you'd be standing in the kitchen, you can see to the living room, and then you see to the gallery beyond. And I actually did this, I'll show you in this slide, is because the house is big, and I like rooms that have windows on more than just one side. It really helps for glare, it makes it more light and spacious, and there are no dark corners. But this living room, there was a hallway beyond it, and I also don't like dark hallways. So we created we put skylights in the hallways, but at the end of the living room we created windows, and these are really wonderful steel casement windows that look very old, but actually they're brand new. And so you get some borrowed light from the hallway into the living room, and from the living room into the hallway. There's a wraparound deck, reminiscent of a slower time in history and lifestyle, and it helps reduce the bulk and scale of the house and allows the visitor to see hints of other parts. And as the house faces north, the south light illuminates with the backlighting, and it filters through the windows, the open porch. Now, while the overall character of the house is intended to be early 20th century La Jolla, there are many contemporary elements to this house that bring it into the 21st century. There's board form concrete, sleek lighting and plumbing fixtures. There's refined detailing, and then there's a more sophisticated set of proportions that contribute to the modern interpretation of the cottage's traditional style. And then the amenities. This is the kitchen, and it's a bit bigger than what I imagine was in the original house. And it flows into other rooms. From the kitchen you can see into the living room, you can see into the family room, you can have your ear on the kids' playroom. And no longer is mom locked away in the kitchen. which would have been small, and maybe it had one door, swung both directions, alone in the kitchen, toiling away. But now the kitchen is much more central. And this is showing how the kitchen flows into the family room, and how that family room flows to a covered porch, and that covered porch out into the backyard. This house had a couple of code issues. The first is that up in this neighborhood in the Muirlands, it was governed by CC&Rs, and one of the conditions is that it's limited to a single story. But this house was on a very steep slope, and single story was open for interpretation on a steep slope. But in this case, what we've done is actually the garage, which you see on the far left, is in a basement. And you see a dormer window above it, up in the attic, is actually on the opposite side, the pool cabana, which is also at grade. So we had the garage at grade, basement, and the pool cabana, attic at grade. It worked. There's another important code we're contending with on this project, and that is one of fire codes. The house, as many in La Jolla are, is located in the VHFHSZ, which stands for the Very High Fire Hazard Severity Zone. You ought to check this map. Your house might be located in it. A piece of it was in the La Jolla Light, I think, a week or two ago. So with the wildfires San Diego's experienced over the past 8 years, we've learned much about wildfires and how to build our homes to be resistant. So this house has, well, it has wood siding, but the wood siding is installed over fire retardant boards. You'll see no wood on the roof. Those are asphalt shingles. And the rafter tails that you do see are at a minimum 4 inches wide, which is much thicker than the original design, which would have had thin 2-bys. This is the backyard looking back through the covered patio, through the family room, off into the kitchen. And a view from the street at night. So I'd like to talk about the 50% rule, because I just can't pass up the opportunity to talk about this slide, which is the effect of the coastal exemption rule, where as an alternative to a time-consuming, costly, invasive coastal development permit, you can do this to your house. You see, in the coastal zone, which is most of our properties west of Interstate 5, and most of them here in La Jolla, there's a regulation that says if you tear your house down, you need to go through a coastal development review process. And this is a discretionary review process and can be time-consuming, can be costly, and it subjects you to scrutiny of most of the departments down at the city, along with the scrutiny of most of your neighbors. But what if you want to remodel and not tear down the house? Certain remodels are exempt from this review. This is a section straight out of the code. The coastal exemption states that if 50% of the existing studs, more or less, 50% of the existing studs remain in place and intact, you can remodel at will without the necessity of a coastal development permit. Of course, you still need to follow all the other elements of the land development code. On the one hand, architects and homeowners have found fairly clever ways of retaining half of the framing and delivering an entirely new house. On the other hand, it's been seen as a way of circumventing the codes and circumventing the community's right to review. So this is precisely one of those areas where it's a good regulation if it's your own home and your own remodel, but it's not a good regulation if it's that of your neighbors. This is a major remodel done 20 years ago using the coastal exemption. The photo on the top was right after the house was built, sometimes in the late 40s. The owners will nod, yes, I got that right. And it's still a small house by today's standards, and that's the one on the bottom. We didn't make this house much larger in square footage, but we did increase the volume of many rooms and added a skylight along the length of a long, narrow hallway, all of which give the perception of spaciousness, albeit without the elbow room. But it still lends a sense of greater space. I think it's interesting to note that this house, once remodeled, became a one-bedroom house with a separate guest quarters above. Some people these days might say that a one-bedroom is impossible when it comes to resale. My contention is that you should build for your own needs and for those of your family, and not for some phantom mystery buyer sometime in the future. The homeowners had lived in this house for 20 years before they did the remodel, and they've lived in it another 20 years. So certainly their return on investment has penciled out, and they didn't have to compromise their wants or desires for some future homeowner. Some more photos. And for those of you who know me or know this house, this remodel is how I met my husband. This is one of the few times, though, on this project that the LDC dictated part of the design. It specifically covers site walls that you can see here in the foreground and then on the far left. Site walls, when in the front yard setback, must be 50% open when above 3 feet tall. The homeowners wanted as much privacy as they could possibly get, as they're on the corner of an alley and Pearl Street. So what we did, we made the wall very thick, and the openings are angled so that if you're standing right in front of the house, you see through the openings. So that's the upper left photo. But if you're approaching the house obliquely, or when you're standing on the property looking out, the slanted sides provide privacy. So this is as you're approaching the house, and the lower left is if you're on the property looking out. So my next example of how we've used the codes on projects has to deal with contextualism. The neighborhood that this house is in, the Barber Track, has traditional home styles. The smaller homes are the cottage types, and the larger homes are either Spanish or English Tudor. And at least one of the former was designed by George Washington Smith, and many of the latter were designed by Edgar Ulrich. Both were master architects of a more romantic style. But the client on this house was looking for something quite modern. Now, Angelus has already ratted me out on this. I wasn't going to say that this was a Sim Bruce Richards house, but now you know. But you're looking at it and you're saying, what did he do? Well, he did actually, it was probably a nice little house, but the subsequent owners, somebody down the line, decided a bay window and brick siding and a little mansard roof would be really charming, and it totally ruined what was really charming about Sim Bruce Richards' design. Sim Bruce Richards did get something wrong here, though. He had, in his original design, he had corner windows, and they were on the left side of the building. Breezes were coming from the other direction, and the house was as stuffy as it could be. But the old house was originally dwarfed and shaded by two-story homes on either side. This limited the source of ocean breezes, along with the poor window placements that I just mentioned, and some potential ocean views. And to a lesser degree, it kept sunlight out of some spaces. So the scale in the neighborhood, seems to me, is already set. So to meet the design goals, I had to come to terms with the desire for an experimental modern home in a neighborhood of beautiful traditional houses. So I started by looking at the building materials that were common to different building periods, but very typical in this area. The materials are used as part of this investigation I was doing in justifying old and new, modern with traditional. And so I wanted to use materials such as concrete, redwood siding, wood windows, and copper. I had mentioned George Washington Smith and Edgar Ulrich as being master architects who had done work in this neighborhood. Well, the neighborhood also boasts Irving Gill and Rudolf Schindler, both master architects of a different style. And both these two architects experimented with concrete in La Jolla. Schindler with the El Pueblo Rivera homes, and Irving Gill in the Women's Club. Well, I had a keen interest in exploring the use of cast-in-place concrete as a traditional building material. I saw it as a symbolic replacement for the thick stone walls or a double-wide brick wall that you might find in very old homes. The material, for some, is thought to be cold and institutional and impersonal. In actual fact, I find concrete, cast-in-place concrete, to be quite warm and protective. It's a material that can be very useful and adaptive in the design of a modern architecture. The redwood siding was often used on early buildings in La Jolla, and also a lot on Scripps Institute of Oceanography. The material is allowed to weather to a beautiful deep brown. Copper, one of the other materials I wanted to experiment with, is typically the preferred metal for the beach community because it's considered low maintenance and corrosion resistant. So with this material too, it can be seen as a cold metal, but once installed can appear warm and traditional. So the solution I wanted to develop was a design that suggested an inviting interior but at the same time expressed a strong, fortified exterior. This concept is at the heart of residential architecture as I see it. A warm environment that protects us. Here is the shelter from the elements and wild creatures that I had mentioned earlier. Present-day requirements are the same, though the wild creatures are of a different variety and not usually four-legged. But nonetheless, the protection is critically important. I'm willing to accept the accusation that I actually got from one building inspector who asked me, what is it with you women architects and these concrete buildings? Is it maternal or something? I'm guessing that there were another number of concrete buildings designed by women architects that were being built at the time. Well, maybe it is a maternal instinct, as this was a house originally designed for my own family, that had created the desire to develop an environment that was very solid, very protective, but and even intimidating, and yet can be quite warm and accommodating. And I know some of my book club friends are here, so I don't want any wisecracks about Mama Grizzly or the fact that I dressed as Sarah Palin one Halloween. So the design solution continually crosses back and forth from cold to warm, ancient to modern, masculine to feminine, predictable to unexpected, private to communal, all reinforcing the initial concept. The original house, well, let me flip through some of these interiors. We really wanted the cast-in-place concrete walls to show on the interior. It seemed to me if you're going to explore this kind of material, it's such an interesting material, you don't want to cover it up. Though I do remember someone coming to visit the house once saying, well, what are you going to put on these walls? They kind of whispered, oh, she's finished. At one point when we got the bills for the walls, I think we said, oh, the walls are the art. There will be no art on the walls. Okay, so the original house had a single car garage. I don't know if you remember it back from the other slides. But with a small garage door, which was quite common in this neighborhood, just one car garage. And I felt that this was a very important point, is that it contributed to the scale of the neighborhood. Like tract homes, you see a lot of houses, you see a lot of tract homes that have two-car garages, and then like there's the door, and that's the lot. And a lot of these lots in this neighborhood, actually in a lot of the neighborhoods in La Jolla, they're 50 feet wide. And so if you take 25 feet of that and you make it a garage door, well, if you make it a garage, then you've eaten up nearly half the house with the door. And I didn't want to introduce that to this charming neighborhood. So, and code dictates that you park two cars on the lot somewhere on site. So we had to have at least two cars on site. The solution to this was, to the single car garage, was to take the garage underground, which is what we did. In doing so, we accomplished a couple of things. One is I was able to get the garage door, and it's just 10 feet wide, so just 2 feet wider than a normal single car garage door. It provided a garage that accommodated up to 5 cars. Had room for a laundry room, an exercise room, and a large wine cellar. And I got a lot of natural light into that basement. This is a swimming machine. It's no longer in that house. It's not a spa. Also, San Diego's zoning regulations allow us to omit the subterranean areas from the floor area ratio, thereby allowing us a little bit more, allowing us as much floor area as possible to be dedicated to living space. So I've discussed size, character, the 50% rule, and contextualism impacts from and on our codes and regulations. But there's one more factor that has influenced homes in La Jolla that some codes have been better at dealing with, which is the concept of return on investment. So return on investment as the driving force for buying, modifying, or building a home. When did one's home start to get considered as a substantial source of capital gains? Up to this point, maybe the most impactful thing to happen to our neighborhoods had been the diversity in styles and the changes in styles, like modern morphing into postmodern, like the house on the left. The diversity can add to the wonderful character and variety found in established architecturally integrated neighborhoods like La Jolla. And I really love that about La Jolla, is that we're tolerant of a lot of styles. Though I'm showing one of my least favorite houses, which is the house on the left, right next to one of my most favorite houses, which is the house on the right. The market forces that have been driving up property values have left some home buyers thinking more about how to capitalize to the fullest degree possible on their financial investments. Their thoughts are focused on the bottom line, on return on investment, resale value, maximum square footage, and maximum bang for the buck, rather than on shelter for their families. Well, once upon a time, clients would count up their kids, their pets, the mother-in-law, and maybe the domestic help, and they'd figure out, okay, how many bedrooms do we really need? And then they design something to fit their needs. And typically, the house that they've designed for themselves is match the surrounding homes, because those families likely had similar number of kids and pets too. And residential bulk and scale was rarely an issue. In the 1960s, when most of the codes were written, the issues were population growth, high-rise buildings, and traffic congestion. And the concern was, where are all these families going to fit in La Jolla? And so it was more about stemming the flood of people moving here, and codes requiring more off-street parking in the form of garages, and then also in establishing a height limit, which eventually happened along the coast statewide with Prop D. But then the concept of conspicuous consumption crept in. The quaint idea of shelter was overshadowed by ROI and maximum floor area ratio. And some owners, while interviewing an architect, rather than providing that list of what they really need, started asking with the first question of, well, how big can I make this? And how much is allowable? And who were they building for anyway? Instead of building for their families, they were building for some future family who might want a really big house, and who would have the resources, and this future family would have the resources to pay top dollar for it. And while La Jolla has always been an upscale community, it's only recently been considered one of the most expensive communities in the country. And it didn't happen because of our small and quaint cottages. So our current issues have more to do with old versus new, and small bungalow versus maximum floor area ratio. I'd like you to keep in mind, though, I'm not making a judgment call on this. I'm making observations of what changes what changed that makes our codes effectual tools, or effectual tools for design, or ineffectual nuisances. So I think I've driven the point home that projects such as Windermere and Black Horse Farms are fixed in their designs. So love them, hate them, if you will, but they are what they are. And as I've heard the kids say, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. The La Jolla LDC, the Land Development Code, excuse me, and the La Jolla Community Plan is clear, concise enough. It's maybe lacking in inspiration. But certainly quite tolerant of individualization. Neighbors can count on guidance and support from the city that new developments will be in keeping and character with the neighborhood, and has enough regulation to prevent runaway development while still allowing architects and property owners plenty of room to maneuver around and experiment if that's the desired result. The La Jolla Shores at PDO at this point is our problem child. For it started out as a great idea, but issues have arisen that up to this point have gone unaddressed. The original PDO was written as a reaction to some unfortunate and unpopular development at the time. It appears as if history is repeating itself, that we're at a similar turning point, and resolution must be sought. The bickering and family infighting does justice to no one, not the longtime residents who's maintained their status quo, or the longtime residents who's finally ready to remodel or rebuild after all those years of living there, or the newcomer who's accidentally walking into this melee. So bang some heads together, but the entire family, mom, dad, the kids, that was the advisory board, the city, property owners, need to come to some consensus of what they want and what they can tolerate for their neighborhood, be it adopting the land development code and the community plan, or tossing out the PDO and starting from scratch. And if the PDO is no longer the inspiration it once was, maybe it's time to determine just what does and will inspire coming generations.